Part 16. Forging swords. After sending Jun Yi away, Yi Yang obviously let go a lot. He saw several soldiers move a half-waist-high tripod, nodded with satisfaction, and then directed the first few craftsmen to make fire. There are 6 steps in casting Longchen's sword. 1. Hammering. 2nd. Planning file. 3. Polishing. 4th. Inlay. 5th. Quenching. 6th. Steel grinding. But now the time is pressing. Yi Yang gave up the 3 or 4 steps, and only needs 1, 2, 5, and 6 steps. Of course, the most important thing is the first step. Repeated folding and forging. A good Longchen sword needs to be folded and forged at least a dozen times. Yi Yang explained it to them, but these craftsmen had never operated it before, so one by two, they all showed blank expressions like listening to a book from heaven. In the end, Yi Yang had no choice but to do it himself. He fastened his wide sleeves with a neck climber, picked up an iron sword and threw it into the calciner. When it is red hot, take it out with pliers, put it on the iron plate, and hit it with a hammer. Everyone looked at Yi Yang with bewildered expressions. They really didn't understand. What's the use of beating the red-hot iron sword like this? Everyone, this step is called forging. A piece of iron needs to be folded and forged at least a dozen times to make a good sword. Yi Yang explained while hitting the red-hot iron with a hammer. To be honest, the craftsmen didn't understand, but they learned that this was something arranged by the emperor, and they dared not delay the business. Although they were full of doubts, they also obediently learned Yi Yang's method to forge iron blocks. Due to the lack of time, Yi Yang did not return to the palace, and stayed in the military equipment supervision all day, personally supervising these craftsmen forging iron. In order not to waste a minute and a second, he divided a dozen groups of people to take turns to strike iron. And he did not miss the time at night, and worked overtime to make the craftsmen keep folding and forging iron blocks. Afraid of failure, he forged 5 pieces of iron at the same time. If these 5 swords were not successful, it can only be said that God wants to send him to the cold palace. After 5 days of tossing and turning like this, someone finally took advantage of Yi Yang's rest and complained, "What is this young concubine Yi trying to do? Why do we have to fold and beat these pieces of iron repeatedly?" That's right, a layman instructed us to make swords. And I don't know what the above thought. Shish. A blacksmith man immediately made a gesture of silence, lowered his voice and said, "It was arranged by the emperor. You should talk less. If these words reach the emperor's ears, you will all be dead." Several craftsmen were so frightened that they turned pale. He quickly lowered his head and continued to beat the iron block in front of him. And Jun Yi in the palace learned that the blacksmiths were still beating iron blocks. And there was no sword shape at all, and he couldn't figure out what Yi Yang wanted to do. 10 days later, when the complaints became more and more, Yi Yang finally stopped them from folding and forging iron blocks repeatedly. Hearing that they didn't need to forge iron blocks, they all looked happy. They followed Yi Yang's words and made sword blanks from the iron blocks that had been repeatedly folded and forged, and started the second step, planning and filing. Planning file. Use a steel knife to sharpen the file, so that the thickness of the sword body is moderate, and there is a certain slope between the sword ridge and the blade. The sword ridge must be in the middle of the sword body and be in a straight line. Yi Yang, who did not have a steel blade, could only rely on the calcination technique. He repeatedly beat the red burning sword blank into the shape of a sword. Due to the limited technique, the blade he struck was as ugly as it was ugly. At the same time, in the side hall of Xingchen Palace, several ministers learned that Yi Yang was still beating iron blocks, and could not help but slander. "Your Majesty, it's been 10 days since this concubine Yi went to the military equipment supervision, but I heard that he still makes the craftsman keep beating the iron blocks. Which is really puzzling. Prime Minister Zuo stepped forward and said with a worried look on his face, Your Majesty, if things go on like this minister is really worried that young concubine Yi won't be able to create the Longchen sword that he spoke of this. The officials from the Zuo Prime Minister's line quickly agreed. Your Majesty, I have heard that this young concubine Yi has never been exposed to weapons, so it would be a joke to let him cast swords. Your Majesty, why don't you let the military equipment supervision make a heavy and big one while you have a few days left? When the sword comes out, the minister will not believe in the black iron sword that can never cut the Holy Dynasty. Some people began to think that it was a good idea. Your Majesty, the method that Lord Wang said is wonderful. Someone agreed. Wonderful? Zhun Yi sneered and asked them back, who is responsible for lifting the cumbersome iron sword? Are you? The civil servants were dumbfounded by Zhun Yi. If you are really worried, just use your actions to prove it. Instead of slandering others here. Zhun Yi placed the bamboo slips in his hands on the desk, frightening the officials below to keep quiet and dare not make remarks. In the military equipment supervision, Yi Yang, who had cast the sword body, was very satisfied when he saw the sword he had forged by himself. He put the cast sword body into the calcining furnace and continued to calcine it. The next step is to enter the next step, quenching. Use the traditional quenching method to make the sword body both rigid and flexible, able to bend and stretch. He immediately put the red-hot sword into the cold water, only to hear the sound of zizi, which made everyone curiously look forward to it. Seeing their curious expressions, Yi Yang began to popularize science. Everyone, this step is called quenching, which is to put the beaten steel knife on the fire and burn it red, and then immediately put it into cold water to properly dip it, and let it cool down suddenly. Repeat this a few times, and the steel knife will become tough and flexible. Everyone looked at Yi Yang's operation and nodded their heads. After the quenching step was completed, Yi Yang handed the finished Longchen sword to the craftsman beside him, and said, The rest is the grinder. When you polish the blade, you will know what 100 refinement is. A few days ago, Yi Yang kept saying it, but they had never seen the real sword, so they couldn't understand it. The other craftsmen were not idle either. Following Yi Yang's previous practice, they made sword blanks from the repeatedly folded iron blocks, and then began to quench them. After quenching several times, they took the sword and went to the sharpening stone to sharpen the blade repeatedly. According to Yi Yang, sharpening a sword needs to go through more than 10 steps of rough grinding, fine grinding, and fine grinding, until it is smooth and bright, the ridges are straight, the groove lines are standard, and the sword body shows mirror and frosted effects. They also heard Yi Yang say, The polished Longchen sword is cold and radiant, and its flowers are self-appearing, which is very beautiful. One by one is full of energy, working overtime and night to grind the blade. When they saw that the sword body was bright, it was completely different from the black it used to be, and their eyes glowed. This is the first time they have seen such a beautiful sword. Especially the steel lines on the sword. Although the steel lines are confusing, they are also very endearing. This is the first time they have seen steel lines on the sword. Master Concubine Yi. What is this? Why are there patterns on it? Someone asked curiously. You must know that he participated in the whole process of casting the sword, but he did not see Yi Yang's engraving on the sword. That's a steel pattern, it was repeatedly folded and forged, isn't it pretty? Yi Yang rolled his sleeves and sat on the stool with Erlang's legs crossed. Good looking, very good looking. Everyone looked at the sword in their hands and was very satisfied. This is probably the best looking sword they've ever made. Not only is it beautiful, but it's also very sharp. After you've sharpened it, I'll show you what a truly peerless sword is. A group of craftsmen gathered around Long Chen's sword, looking forward to how sharp the sharpened sword is.